Okay, hopefully you're seeing my title slide, Chris, is that true?
Yes.
Okay, it must be. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Bill Clace. I'm a natural resources educator with UW Extension, and tonight I'll be talking about harvesting trees for your own use. And some of the things we'll cover tonight is the importance of having a plan for your forest, and so to help meet your goals and to get exactly what you want from your forest, and choosing the right trees to cut and which ones to leave, and we'll touch a bit on felling trees safely and efficiently. And so after tonight, you'll understand the importance of having a plan before you even start felling trees, and you'll know which ones to harvest, which ones to leave to help meet the objectives outlined in your plan. And finally, you'll know some of the really important techniques for using a chainsaw and felling trees so you can do it in a safe and efficient manner. Okay, so why have a management plan? Well, a management plan will help you to get to where you want to be. In it, you'll describe things like, well, what are my objectives? What do I need to do to my forest to accomplish those objectives? How can I go about doing that? And when should I be doing those kind of activities to get to where I want to be with my forest? And for many folks, they feel like, well, I kind of like what I have. It's working out pretty well. But I think you'd be a lot more happier if you took some time to put a lot of thought into what exactly you want to get from your forest, what do you want it to look like, and what do you need to do to get to where you'll get everything you want from your forest. And during this planning process, we'll really help you to clarify what those needs and your goals are. You'll spend a lot of time thinking about, well, I know I bought the land for recreational purposes, but I also like to do this, this, and this, and this. And something you might not have thought of when you're just standing out in the woods with your chainsaw, thinking about, well, I need to get some firewood, which trees should I harvest? It'll help you to think about all those activities in a bigger context and help you to clarify exactly, again, what you want to get from your forest and how to get there with the activities you're going to undertake over the next few years. So, what should your management plan contain? Obviously, you start with what your goals and objectives are for your forest. And they should be as detailed as you can make them. The more detailed, the better. If you just say, well, I want more wildlife, that's not going to be as useful to you in your endeavor as opposed to saying, well, I want more grouse, or I want to harvest some trees to use for myself, isn't as specific as, well, I need to harvest so many trees, so I need 10 cords of firewood every year, and I want so many building materials to help me construct a shed, or I need so many posts, so I need to cut out some posts to build so many, cut down so many trees to build so many posts to maintain the fence that I have. The more detailed you can get, the better. And you also need to know what's out there in your forest. So you need to do an inventory or have someone do an inventory of the trees that you have out there. And it could be something you do yourself or hire someone to do. But in that inventory, you're going to take stock of what trees you have, how old they are, which species, and how dense they are in different parts of your stand. And then putting that information together, you can start to develop a prescription for how to manage the forest and the trees that you have to help meet your goal. And you can this prescriptions can be very specific, very detailed for each different part of your forest. And you can assign these different activities and prescriptions over a longer period of time so that you're not thinking about having to do them all in the first year, which is a common occurrence among many landowners. They think, I got to get all this stuff done right now, when in fact you've got a lot of time, and if you're just patient, you can accomplish all these over the long haul. Here's what a 10-year activity schedule might look like for this particular landowner whose objectives are to improve wildlife habitat and provide some income and improve access. In the first year, in all the different parts of their forest, that's what this management unit, they in fact divided up their forest into 5 different units. And in each one, they might have a different activity over the course of these 10 years. Maybe it's lay out trails or do a thinning in Unit 1. Maybe girdle some trees to help create snags for wildlife in Unit 4. 5 or 6 years later, they might do a commercial thinning and create some brush piles. Or kill the grapevines in the 5th year. And then regenerate oak and using a shelterwood method in the 10th year. So this is a very simple kind of management plan or schedule activities you can do by yourself. You don't need a lot of professional help to do something like this. Just a little bit of information can take you a long way. So I encourage you to think about what your objectives are. Try to think about, well, what do I need to do to get there? And then put together a list of activities over a few years that will help you to achieve your goals. A very simple management plan will help you do that. I encourage you to undertake that process. at least try to get started on. If you need help, we'd be happy to offer you some suggestions on things you can look for and people you can talk to and publications that will help you get there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about choosing the right trees to harvest to meet your goals. Before we get into too many details about that, I wanted to get us all on the same page of the terminology we might be using here tonight. So here's, let's say this is a typical stand. It has different size trees, some small trees, some big trees, and some in between. And we've named these different kinds of trees to help us categorize the trees in our forest. The biggest trees that stand above a lot of the other trees are called the dominant trees. Sunlight hits all over the canopy. The next size trees are called the codominants. Sunlight only hits on 3 sides of their canopy, and they're a bit smaller than the dominant trees. The next step down are what's called the intermediate trees. They only get sunlight at the very top of their trees, and they're kind of crowded out by these other bigger trees around them. And the smallest trees are called suppressed trees because they don't get much sunlight underneath the canopy of these other bigger trees. And their growth is really suppressed. They're not growing very fast at all because they're not getting enough sunlight. But if we remove some of these other trees, especially like these 3 right here, these suppressed trees will have plenty of room to grow, and they'll suddenly take off and grow very quickly. So we've got some broad guidelines of what to think about when you're removing trees. And removing trees, and the idea is to favor the trees that you appreciate the most or you want to have the most. And we can call these favored trees, we'll call them crop trees. We want to favor the crop trees and try to give them as the best opportunity to grow and be vigorous and healthy trees. So we're promoting this quality improvement of our crop trees. And it could be anything. They could be trees that for highest economic value. They could be trees that are best for wildlife production. They could be great firewood trees. They could be great trees for whatever reason. We're focusing on these crop trees and trying to get the most of these that our objectives call for. And when we do removal of these kinds of trees, we have a sequence of our list of activities to do that, this order of removal. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But ultimately, and finally, we want to make sure that we get, it's one thing to cut down trees and keep cutting down trees in your stand and try to promote certain trees, but you got to make sure that you're getting the kinds of seedlings in that'll ultimately continue to supply those trees long into the future that you want. So we need to have some kind of plan that will make sure we have adequate regeneration. And an uneven age system is, most of the hardwood forest or broadleaf forest here in Wisconsin are an uneven age system. That's a fancy way of saying there's trees of all different ages. Some of them are 1 or 2 years old, some of them are hundreds of years old, and all kinds of ages in the middle. Most of our hardwood or broadleaf forests are like that here in Wisconsin. So it can be kind of tricky to make sure you get the right kind of regeneration of the trees that you want. There's some simple things you can do to make sure that it happens. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that in particular. I'm more interested in sharing information about which trees to remove and how to favor certain trees. Okay, there are some things that you can keep an eye out for that can affect the growth and quality of your favored trees, your crop trees. And you might want to favor against the trees with these characteristics, with forks or sprouting, epichronic branches, seams, cankers, and rot. And I'll talk a bit about these first 5. I'm not going to talk much about stand history this evening. That's a huge topic on itself. But I'll talk about these first 5 and the consequence it can have of either having those or not, or getting rid of those. Forks are a very common occurrence in our trees, especially oak trees. And it's this beautiful fork tree right here is an oak, and this tree has a lot of different characteristics to it that will favor certain kinds of management prescriptions and objectives. So this is a great tree if you're managing for wildlife, or if managing for firewood. It's got a lot of branches, it's got a lot of wood in it, and all these little crooks and these long spreading branches create great wildlife habitat. A lot of wildlife use and find shelter in these little crooks, or use a big tree like this to roost in. Turkeys will use a big tree like this to roost in. And there's a lot of wood here for firewood. Now, from a purely economical point of view, it doesn't have a whole lot of value. It is basically a firewood tree. It's not a tree that's going to sell for thousands of dollars because it's this great, big, beautiful, straight tree like the one right behind it. Where's my pointer? There it is. This one right behind it. It doesn't have a low fork. It has a nice straight stem that doesn't have any branches on it. It'll probably be a very valuable tree in the future from a purely economic point of view. And so you have to decide which one of these to favor. If you're looking for wildlife, this is a great tree to maintain. If you're looking for straight trees you might want to cut up and make boards out of, or sell because it has high economic value, then maybe the straight one is more important to you. One of the downsides of forked trees is that water can collect in the forked part, right there in the crotch of the tree, and that can lead to a rot or a fungal infection kind of getting into the center of the tree right at that fork, because the water just sits there and it kind of percolates down, and you can get a rot in there. And you can see that's what happened to this forked tree here. You can see the rot has gotten all the way down to the bottom, and there's a seam there, and pretty soon this tree isn't going to live very long because of that. So there is a downside to it. But some of the forks are very sound, like in the picture of the last slide I had, and will last for a long time. But not all trees can do that. Epicormic branching is just a fancy way of saying branching along the stem of the tree, along the main stem, and that's what you're seeing in this picture. This is a result of an insect attack, or the tree getting too much sunlight all of a sudden. It's kind of a funky looking tree, and you might want to maintain it because it has a lot of character to it. But from a purely economic point of view, this is not a very valuable tree, because all these branches create more knots, and the more valuable trees are the ones with fewer branches, and so you get cleaner wood without knots. But as a firewood tree, it's probably fine, and it might have a lot of character to it if you're going to harvest trees for hobbying. So you have to decide whether that's important or not, and whether it fits in your objectives or not. Seams are a common occurrence in many hardwood trees. You can see the seam running along the edge here of this tree. It might have been the result of a lightning strike, and the lightning will spiral down the tree and get down into the ground. Or it could have been struck when another tree fell and there was a wound that kind of slowly spread and got infested with a disease that's slowly infesting this tree, and you're creating the seam. So if you have two trees next to each other about the same size, and one is without defects whereas this one has a seam, you might think that this is probably a better tree to harvest and get off the stem, because it's probably not going to live as long, and it won't create as good of wood as maybe another tree that's healthier. Cankers and rot are a very common occurrence in trees in Wisconsin. Often most of them are the result of some kind of fungal infection. This is a canker on this side of the tree. There was probably a wound here that became infected by a canker and is slowly eating away at the tree. This one probably won't last much longer. And this is what's called black knot in these trees. It's a very common disease that many of our hardwood trees can get infested with. If you do have trees with black knot or canker, unless you really like the way they look, I encourage you to get them off your property, because that disease can spread to other trees, and pretty soon you don't want these. It can infect a tree or a wound where there's a wound, and pretty soon you won't be getting the big straight trees or larger trees and healthy trees that you might be shooting for. And if you do have trees with cankers and you'd rather not have them, or it doesn't fit with your management plan, cut them down, use them for firewood or something else. Same with black knot. What happens is the black knot fungus will eat away into the center of the tree, and pretty soon the top of these trees will just snap off in the wind. So if you're trying to decide which one of these trees to harvest to make room for the others, these with black knots are a great example of ones to do that, along with this tree with a canker on it. But ultimately, you have to decide what's important for you and what fits with your management plans. And I like to use these slides to demonstrate part of that equation. So here's some beautiful straight trees on the right, this sugar maple and this yellow birch. These are really high quality trees. They're veneer quality. They're highest value trees. They're worth a lot of money. If you had a whole forest of these kinds of trees, you'd have a nice bit of coin right there at your disposal. Great from a purely economical point of view. These trees are the best thing you could probably have. But maybe that's not your goal. Maybe making the most money isn't what you're looking for. Maybe you're looking for other things, wildlife habitat or aesthetics or something. And so I encourage you to think about maybe leaving a few trees like this one on the left. It's not that pretty of a tree. In fact, pretty is a subjective thing. It's the eye of the beholder. But it's got a lot of character to it. And look at it, was leaning over, and then the top broke off, and a new branch took over to become the top. When you see that tree, you'll always know where you are in the forest. You'll know exactly where you are. Whereas if you have a whole forest of these straight trees, you can get lost pretty easily. And you might notice and remember stories about, I saw grouse drumming on that tree, or there was a bunch of squirrels that were chasing each other up and down that tree. Whatever the case may be, don't be afraid to to do something a little bit different to maybe give your forest a little more character or make it a little more appealing aesthetically. That kind of stuff still fits in with your objectives. I imagine it's very true that you might not list it as one of your objectives to have some aesthetic appeal to your forest, but most likely you do. One of the reasons you own a forest is because you like being there, you like looking around and seeing the different things going on. And trees like this with character are a good addition to your stand. Okay, here is this order of removal that I talked about earlier, and it's just a sequence of activities that you undertake when you're standing in your forest trying to decide which trees to harvest, especially if you have too many trees and you got to get rid of them so you can favor certain trees. But I encourage you to think about this. Don't start thinking about this order of removal with the chainsaw in your hand. I encourage you to get out in your stand and look around before you start cutting or even think about cutting, and start thinking about and start marking trees according to this sequence of removal, this order of removal. And then look what the consequences are from starting from the top and doing some of that each activity, and see if you're getting to where you want to be. So where you start is identifying and removing the high-risk trees. And this tree on the right is a great example of that. It's got a canker in it, another one with a canker in it. It's taken over more than half of the stem of the tree, so this tree isn't going to live very long, probably another 5 to 10 years, and that's high-risk trees are identified as those that might live between 5 to 15 years more before they die. So you can either leave this one to eventually die and continue to shade out these better trees underneath it, or you can harvest it and remove it and make room for these other trees to grow. Now, my wife and I have, this is actually on our property, and every year my wife and I have a conversation about this tree. I say, I think we should remove this tree because, you know, it's crowding out these other trees. And she says, I think it's got a lot of character, I think we should leave it. And so every year we leave the tree and we move on to something else. So the next thing to think about after we remove the high-risk trees, and you still need to do some more with your forest because it's just too many trees, is the idea of how can I improve the growing conditions of the trees I want to favor. And that's what we mean by release the crop trees. Make more room for them to grow. Release them from the stifling conditions of being too crowded by other trees. And so in this case, this is a before and after. Before is on the left and after is on the right. In this case, the landowner wanted to maintain the trees, the real straight, tall trees of a certain species. And so this is the after. Here's the before. So they took out this tree with a lot of low limbs of low quality. This one has a broken top. They took that one out. Took out so many small trees to make room for their favorite trees to grow. That's what we mean by releasing crop trees. So the first step is to get rid of the ones that aren't going to live very long. The next one is to identify where your favorite trees are and improve conditions for them to grow. The third one is to identify and remove trees with poor form or quality. And so maybe you're to the point where you've got the right trees you want on your property, but it's still a bit too crowded, so you need to decide some of these trees got to come out. And so then you take a look at, this I talked about cankers and seams and broken tops and limbiness. This is where you want to think about, which of these trees is going to best fit my objectives. And for many times, you also want to think about what's going to make the forest as healthy as it can. What's going to promote the growth of the healthiest and best trees. So we're removing trees with a cavity in them. This was probably a wound on the tree, and you can see it's trying to callus over it and compartmentalize this wounded section of it. It's got a vine growing on it here, and some of the bark is sloughing off on this one. So these might be good candidates to remove to make room for your better trees to grow. Here's some more. This particular tree has a broken top, and so it's never going to become a huge tree, and it might not live very long. But on the flip side, this is a great wildlife tree. And in fact, this broken top, when it finally rots out, this would be great space for a little cavity for wildlife to utilize. And this tree in the middle here has got some kind of sweeps in it. And so if you're looking to raise trees that are perfectly straight so you can saw them into boards or posts or something, a tree that's kind of wiggly like this one isn't going to be, you're not going to get very long boards out of it, maybe 8 feet, when instead you might need 10 or 16-foot boards. And then here's a limby tree that has a lot of low limbs. Again, if you're looking for trees that are going to be clear of limbs so that you get good clean boards out of them for whatever, this might be a good candidate to remove from the stand and make room for these other trees around it to grow. Okay, the next step is to think about, well, which species do I want to favor? And you might have your favorite, overall favorite species, let's say it's oak or something, but you're going to have a mixture of species, and I encourage you to promote a mixture of species on your stand, because that'll protect against an insect or disease coming along and wiping out the entire forest because it's all the same species. So have a mix of trees. And I'll talk a little bit about species consideration using the example of firewood. Now, as you know, that all trees are made the same when it comes to producing a lot of heat. And some trees, like hickory, have a lot more heat value than things like basswood and box elder, who have maybe a third to even more or less of a heat value. So if you're thinking about, well, I do need 10 cords, and I'd rather have oak than birch on my property because oak's going to have a lot more heat value than, say, than white birch, and so maybe promote that species, or sugar maple versus basswood. Here's another example of the species consideration. You might think, in the way of firewood, you might think that, well, I like to have trees that are easy to split since I use them all, versus ones that aren't as easy to split. And oak is a great example of these easier to moderate easy splitting. And here's a piece of red oak right here, and you can see that all of these fibers are almost perfectly straight and aligned and vertical. And that means when you hit it with a maul, the maul goes basically right through it, and so it splits really easy. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum is elm, this is a piece of right here. And you can see these fibers kind of go at an angle. In fact, when a tree grows, the fibers will spiral up the tree. And so instead of it just falling apart when you hit it with a maul, the maul will strike. Where's my pointer? There it is. The maul will strike about halfway here and get stuck in some of the fibers. So it can be really difficult to split. So obviously you might want to favor oak versus elm because you make your life easier in splitting. And that fits well with which one has the most heat value too. Okay, so you're at the end of the list of order of removal, and you've done everything else, and you still have too many trees. And so then you have to think about what's the right spacing or density of trees to make sure that the ones I favor, my crop trees, have a lot of room to grow. So the question to ask is, how do I figure out what's the right time, how often should I do it, and how much space should I leave for my favorite trees to grow? And so here, a rule of thumb is whenever the crowns of the trees, the tops of the trees, meet the surrounding trees and interfere with each other, that's the time you need to create more space for that tree or remove the trees. So here's kind of a graphical way to look at this. Here's a group of trees that are kind of dense. They're a bit too crowded, and there's some in here that you favor and some that you want that are part of your favorite list and some that aren't. And so you think about, well, okay, in this particular example, we want to have tall, straight trees with no low limbs, and those are the kind of trees we want to favor. So you might remove this tree with a low fork, remove this tree that's kind of has some swoop in it, and this one is just a little bit too crowded, so you just remove all three of them might be good trees, just remove one of them to make more room for the others to grow. And here's a species that you don't want among these. And so what you're left with after you remove those 4 trees in this example is your remaining trees have a lot more space to grow. And it's just as simple as that. Here's another way of thinking about it. When you're looking up into the crown of a tree, say this tree in the middle is your favorite tree. This is the one this is your crop tree. This is the one you want favored to grow. And it's surrounded by other trees that are still pretty good. So what do is you remove some of the trees around it to make more room for this one to grow. And you end up with something that looks like this. There's a bit of a gap around the tree. It's not on all 4 sides of the tree. It's on 3 sides of the tree. And that's key, is that you don't want to remove trees on all sides. You want to have some of a buffer next to your tree to protect it in case a strong wind comes around. So remove trees on just 3 sides and create a lot of room for this tree to grow. So this one will really do well, and it's released now from this competition, and it will have all kinds of room to grow. Oops, sorry, jumping ahead. So it's easy for me to say that it's a good idea to do this and you'll get more growth. And that's why having some proof of that is really important. And that's these 2 pictures that I'm showing here this is my proof that it actually works. So these 2 pictures were taken at an experimental forest in northern Wisconsin, where they planted trees about 50 years ago. And in one part of the stand, so these are really close to each other, these two stands of red pine. In this part of the stand, they came in every so often and thinned out the trees, removed some of the trees to make more room for the others to grow. And so what we're left with are these big, beautiful red pine that are about 2 to 3 feet across, with healthy growing and really big trees. They're good-looking trees. In the stand, in this part of that stand, they didn't remove anything. They didn't do anything to it. They let the trees just grow. And all of a sudden, so all you see here is a lot of small trees that are just kind of stagnating and barely growing along. And they'll eventually self-thin themselves out. These really tiny ones will eventually die off and make room for those to grow, but it's taking a long time to do that. And so instead of having trees that are 2 and 3 feet across, you have trees that are 6 inches to 10 inches across. Eventually they might get to this point, but it will take a lot longer to get there. And so this thinning, releasing your crop trees, making more room for them to grow really has a big impact on how healthy the trees are and how much faster they'll get to be big trees and what most people want for their forest. So how do you go about deciding what's too many and what isn't? Well, if you employed a forester to come in and figure out what's the right density to have in my stand, you might see them do something like this. Here's a drawing of a forester tallying the trees in their forest using a tool called an angle gauge. This is a simple, well, for a forester it's a simple tool. It's a quick and easy way to get a determination of how many trees are there in a particular part of the forest. And what a forester will do is they'll do their tally in a number of different places in the forest and produce an estimate of the number of trees. Rather than going through and counting every tree within your woodlot, they just do what's called, they take a sample and then expand that sample out to cover the entire forest. So they might take 3 or 4 or 10 or 15 or 70 or 80 sample plots within your stand and do a little bit of calculation and let you know that, well, you have 500 trees per acre of this species, 200 of this species. The trees are they're mostly in this size classes, 2 to 4 inches in diameter, and they're this kind of quality. So you can do this too. You don't have to use a complex piece of equipment like an angle gauge. You can. Once you figure out how to use it, it's not that complex. It's actually pretty easy to use. But I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. That's a good class for another time. What I'd rather describe to you is a way that you can do it pretty easily, figure out what's the right density for my forest. And so the thing you have to do is take this sample, take a number of samples in your forest to determine what the density of the trees are. And let me hold on a second. And the best way to do that, like I said, rather than measure all the trees in your forest and then do the calculation, the best way to do it is take this sample plot. And what I've learned through this whole process as a forester is that the easier you can make the calculations, the better. And so what someone did was figured out that if you have a circular plot that's 26.3 feet in radius, the plot will be exactly 1/20th of an acre. And so that makes it easy. So let's say there's 10 trees within that 20 acre, within that plot, that 26.3 foot radius circle. There's 10 trees. You multiply that by 20 and you get an estimate of 200 trees per acre. So it's pretty easy to make these calculations and figure it out. So you can do a sample plot to determine if the spacing or density within a part of your forest or throughout your forest is too high, too low, or about right. So what you do is you either use a tape measure, work with a buddy with a tape measure, and stretch it out to 26.3 feet and go around in a circle and count every tree that hits the tape measure. That's bigger than 1 inch in diameter at breast height, which is about 4 feet off the ground. 4.5 feet off the ground. It is exactly 4.5 feet off the ground. Or if you don't have someone to work with that's willing to stand there and hold the tape measure, you can, what a lot of people do is they take a piece of rope, measure out 26.3 feet, cut it, and then attach it to a stake and stick the stake in the ground at the center and then go around in a circle holding that stretched out tight and count every tree that the rope hits. It's a pretty this is a very well-established method for determining if you have the right density of trees. And so you count every tree that's within this sample plot, and you can use that by itself, or you can take a number of different sample plots in a certain part of your forest to determine what the density is. And I encourage you, if you're doing it in a bigger area, I encourage you to take as many plots as you can, just make sure they don't overlap with each other. So, but but then you need to measure the actual trees, how big the trees are, and we need that measurement to be the diameter of the tree. And so you can, foresters also have some tools that they purchase, like a diameter tape or a Biltmore stick, to make this measurement easier. But you don't have to spend anything. If you've got a cloth tape measure, you can measure the circumference of the tree at diameter breast height, which is exactly 4.5 feet off the ground. Measure the circumference, divide by pi, or 3.14159, and you'll get the diameter of the tree. Easy enough? Good. So what do you do with those numbers? Well, let's go back to the example I threw out of, say, you did your plot and you had 10 trees. And then you multiply by 20 to get a number. And so we multiply by 20 because it's 1/20th of an acre to get 200 trees per acre. So according to this 200 trees per acre, we're a bit low of about where we want to be with the number of trees. So that gives you kind of an indication of, well, I probably don't need to thin or do anything and remove much of any of the trees in here because we're already quite a bit below where the average kind of number is of how many trees per acre you should have. But let's break that down even more. Let's say you measured the trees. Of those 10 trees, you had 5 trees that were 3 inches in diameter. And so 5 times 20 is 200. Did I do that right? No, 5 times 20 is 100. Sorry. So we're well below this number. And so which means that we might not have enough of these smaller trees. We also found that there were 2 trees that were 6 inches in diameter. So 2 times 20 is 40. So we're still well below, we're about where we want to be. And then we also had 2 trees that were 12 inches in diameter. So that's 40. So maybe now we're getting somewhere. There might be too many of these bigger trees and not enough of the smaller trees. And then our last tree, the 10th tree, was 18 inches in diameter. 1 times 20 is 20. And here is 17 is the average number we're looking for. So this might indicate that, well, you've got a lot of big trees and a lot of small trees, and there's kind of a unbalanced situation here. You need this right mixture of big and small trees for the forest to be growing well. And so maybe this might call for looking at this closely to determine if maybe you need to remove a big tree, or that this might be a good place to remove a big tree to like the 18-inch tree, or maybe let them go because the stocking is kind of low. But this whole process will give you better indication as to where am I in the ballpark? Is this too crowded? Do I need to let it grow? Do I need to remove some of these trees and make more room for them to grow? And right now, with this quick calculation that we did for these 10 trees in this plot, my feeling is that you probably don't need to do anything, and you could probably come back and let this sit for 5 to 10 years and remeasure it then to see what the growth rate is like and how big the trees are. Okay. Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about felling trees. Now, starting out this whole process of felling trees, you've got to start out with the right safety equipment. And starting out with, to protect your dome, you should get a helmet. And you can get one with or without a face shield. I encourage you to get one with a face shield. You can also get protective goggles. But more often, I don't know how many times I've been out in the woods and got a whole bunch of sawdust kicked up in my face and was glad I had a face shield protecting me from just that event. So goggles work good too, or safety glasses, but a face shield will really protect you well. And a lot of them, the forestry, the loggers helmets come with earmuffs or hearing protection attached right to it, or you can use something else. But make sure you do that kind of stuff to protect yourself. And some of the most common injuries out there from using a chainsaw include injuries to the hands and the legs. So I can also encourage you to get what are called chainsaw chaps. It might seem like they're expensive, but they're really not, and they're well worth it to save you a trip to the emergency room where you've got a whole bunch of big cuts on your leg from your chainsaw. And accidents do happen, even to people who've been running a chainsaw for decades and never had a problem. It doesn't take one little slip up when you're tired and not thinking straight or not focusing, and all of a sudden you've got a big cut on your body that you have to go to the emergency room for. Wearing some kind of protective boots is also a good idea. Tennis shoes are not protective boots. Get something with steel toes on them. They'll protect you the most. I don't know how many times I've been hauling logs or bucking up firewood and dropped a big piece on my toe, and so glad I had steel toe boots on to protect me. Otherwise, it'd been quite painful. And the best thing you can do is to maintain your chainsaw. And that's keeping it sharp, keeping the air filter clean, and just taking really good care of it, because a sharp saw will work so much better for you. It's just like a sharp knife at home. versus a dull knife. You tend to work harder and press more with a dull knife, and that's when accidents happen. With a sharp saw, the work goes much easier, and you tend to working a lot less, putting a lot more effort into it, and you'll be less fatigued and you're more focused, and you'll do things a lot more safely. So the guidelines are sharpen it as often as it needs it, and so you know when your blade is starting to get dull when it's throwing chips instead of sawdust. If it's throwing sawdust, you know it's getting dull. If it's throwing chips, wood chips, then you know it's good and sharp. And if you're cutting things like oak or maple, some really tough, hard wood, you might want to think about running a file over your blade every time you fill it up with gas and oil. Gas and oil. So always fill it up with oil every time you put gas in it. Now, like I said, there's a lot of injuries that happen to the hands and the arms, or the hands and the legs and the feet and the face because of what's called kickback. And that's when you use the tip of the blade rather than the flat part of the bar. That's the part, this is the flat part of the bar is the part you want to use to be cutting with, not the tip, for a couple of reasons. One is that using the tip tends to wear on the whole system a bit harder than using the bar or the flat part of the bar. You get kicked back or kicked down when you use this top quarter of the chainsaw and kick up towards your face and head when you use the bottom portion. Did I see that right? Yep. So you got to remember that those are the kind of forces that are at work. And always keep two hands on your running saw, no matter what. I know people like to show off. You think you're a hot dog and holding one hand. Never work above your head, but always keep two hands on the running saw. When you're not running it, always turn and engage the chain brake. Even if you're walking just a few steps, always engage the chain brake. And when you disengage your chain brake, always have two hands on the saw. So you always have control of that saw. Now the next thing is to make sure you use the right kind of cuts to fell the tree. And the old way of creating the notch or the directional cut was to do something that was 45 degrees. The bottom part would be flat, and then you'd go up at a 45-degree angle. That's old school. That's no longer the recommendation for the correct way to create a notch or the directional cuts. Nowadays, they say the recommendation is to create what's called an open face cut. That's between 70 and 90 degrees. That way, you get the most control you can with when you drop the tree. It's got more room to fall rather than if it's flat, so it won't bounce. It'll fall straight and falls truer. And don't be skimpy with how deep you go into the tree with the notch or the directional cut. The recommendation is either 1/5 or 1/4 the width of the tree should be the width or the depth of the wedge, the notch. And in this picture, that looks like it's almost half, a third to more like a third to a half. So don't be wimpy, don't be skimpy when it comes to creating that notch, that felling, the directional cut. Now there's a new recommendation, maybe some of you have heard of this, for cutting bigger trees. And instead of coming from the back side of the tree and opposite the notch, coming in from the back side until you come to about the hinges and let the whole thing fall over, the new recommendation for big trees is to do what's called a plunge cut. And that's where you plunge, there it is, plunge the tip into, but right behind where the hinge will be in the tree, all the way through the tree, and then work your way back away from the notch. And then when you get to close to the end of the tree, leave about an inch to 2 inches of wood still staying, and pull your saw out the direction you pull it in. And that way, the tree is still standing, and still you've got a lot more control of the tree. It's not starting to fall yet. And when you're ready, you just cut that last bit of 2 inches of holding wood on the back side, and the tree will fall over. And I've practiced this, and I've utilized this system quite a bit. It's actually a lot safer, and you have the tree a lot more in control than just coming in from the back side of the tree. What happens when you come in from the back side is the tree will slowly start to fall. And so you have some control over it, but not as much. It can start and stop, start and stop. It's progress towards coming to a complete fall and being on the ground. Whereas with this plunge cut and leaving the trigger, what's called the trigger at the end, is that you know exactly when it's going to start moving. Once you cut that little bit of holding wood at the end, it'll fall over right away if you've done everything else right. So I encourage you, we're going to post or try to find some good videos of what's called the plunge cut and put links to those on our website. You can take the initiative and go and look for them yourself. the steel chainsaw company produces some good videos on how to do a plunge cut. So I encourage you to do a little Google search and see if you can find those. Otherwise, if we have good ones that we feel comfortable posting, we'll put links to those on our website. Next thing you have to take into account is the direction of the lean of the tree, and just about all of them have some kind of lean to them. They might not be as pronounced as this lean in the picture on the left, but the best thing to do is walk all the way around a tree and try to figure out which way it's leaning. You could even use what's called a plumb bob to see which way the tree is leaning, and try to work with the lean of the tree. Unless it's leaning very heavily, it's a big tree leaning very heavily. Always try to work with the lean and try not to work against it, because you're going to be fighting gravity and a lot of other forces at work trying to get something to fall where it doesn't really want to. And even with a small tree like this one in this picture, this heavily leaning tree, it's very much encouraged to do a notch on the side that you're going to fell it, because what can happen is if you just start to cut right through this tree, it might split along the length, and you get what's called a barber chair, and this can pop up really quickly and possibly hit you. So still put in a notch on the backside, even on a small tree like this, and you'll have a lot more success cutting through it. Okay, now before you start to cut, it's a good idea to find a partner to work with. Never work alone in the woods. Even if you've had decades of experience, accidents do happen, and it's always good to have someone by that can help you in case you get in some serious trouble. And if you haven't, I encourage you to take a chainsaw safety course. There's some offered through the Forest Industry and Safety Training Alliance, also called FISTA. They offer what are called game of logging training sessions that you can take and participate in, and you'd be amazed at how much you can learn from just even if you've been cutting wood for a long time. Some of these experts that have there are really well trained and have some top of the best technology and techniques for cutting safely and efficiently. And before you start cutting, make sure you plan your escape route, and that's 45 degrees in the opposite direction the tree is going to fall. It's not directly behind, it's not anywhere in the direction the tree is falling, 45 in either direction away from the tree, the way the tree is falling. So make sure you can walk away from the tree smoothly without tripping over anything or have to climb over anything, so that you can look over your shoulder occasionally while you're moving away to make sure that it's falling in the right direction. Okay, so you've cut your tree, it's starting to fall. So move away from the tree while it's falling along one of your escape routes. But continue to watch the tree as it's falling, because most common cause of a chainsaw fatality is when a hung up branch or tree falls on the user. So trees are falling, they're hitting other trees many times, and they can cause branches to be flung around. Keep an eye out for something like that. That's why you wear a helmet, to protect yourself, but those kind of things can happen. And hung up trees are some of the most dangerous ones to deal with. It takes it takes some really good technique to get those down safely. And always use your neighbor's truck. And this is a funny picture. I like to use it because I get a laugh out every time I see it. But the guidelines are, if you're going to have a work truck, always park uphill from where you're harvesting trees, and at least 2 tree lengths away from the trees that you're cutting. Why 2 tree lengths? Because let's say the trees are 50 feet tall, and you park 80 feet away. The tree you drop falls towards your truck and hits another tree, and that one is also 50 feet and falls, and that's going to hit your truck. So always park at least 2 tree lengths, 2 tree heights away from the trees you're felling. And don't be this guy. Okay, so you got them on the ground. Now you need to process them into the lengths and the products that you're looking for whatever reason you have trees. So now that there was forces at work when the trees were standing, now that they're on the ground, there's even more forces at work. And you get what's called, depending on how the tree is bent or sitting on the ground, you get what's called tension and compression wood. And the compression wood, the stuff where the kind of compressed, the wood fibers are compressed against each other, is where you get your saw to bind up, and you can have a lot of hard problems trying to get it out. So if you can, try to do most of your work on the tension wood side of the tree, the outside of the curve. The inside of the curve of the tree is where you get your chainsaw to bind. The outside is where you get the most cut, the freer the wood, the freer the chainsaw cut. Thank you. So, but it's still a good idea to make 2 cuts before you cut the tree up into pieces. and your first cut is always on the compression wood side. And here's a couple examples that'll illustrate that. Let's say this log is suspended on the ends in the middle of this, so the compression is on the top as it kind of sags down into this little depression in the floor. Your tension wood is on the bottom. So what you do is you do your first cut on the top, just a small one. Doesn't have to go very far. In this example, it's less than probably a third the width of the tree. Then you pull your saw out before it gets pinched, and then you cut the rest of the way through from the top. Flip side of that is, say the tree is suspended on one end, and so you got compression wood on the bottom and tension wood on the top. And it might seem easy to just, I'll just cut this at the top all the way through and it'll fall down. It's a good idea to still make a small cut on the compression wood side, so that when you do finally meet those two, it'll fall away cleanly, and you won't get breakage in the fibers, and you get some part that sticks out. So it's still a good idea to make an initial cut on the compression wood side of the log, so you get a clean cut all the way through. Now, if you're in a situation where you have to cut through all the way through on the compression side, it's a good idea to use a plastic wedge. And you can buy these where you buy chainsaw equipment. It's an inexpensive little piece of equipment. It might be $8, but it's a great way to keep your saw from pinching. And what you do is, say you have to cut down right through this compression wood to get all the way through the log. You start to cut in, and once the bar is completely inside the tree, you start to put your wedge in. And as your bar gets more and more, as you're cutting farther and farther down a tree, you take a small axe or hatchet or an axe that you might carry and continue to pound the wedge into the tree to make sure that it doesn't pinch into your saw blade. And ultimately, when you get through all the way to the bottom of the tree, it might still stay standing, and then you can just give it a kick or knock the wedge and it'll fall apart. Now, these things are $8. Don't use a steel one. Use a plastic one. If it gets cut up by your chainsaw, who cares? It's better that than trying to pull a pinch saw out of a big log, and you just saved yourself a whole bunch of time and energy by doing that. So now you got it to where you need to get the limbs off. Well, there's some general guidelines for this, and some of these are, assess the down tree. Take a look at it. Where are there branches that are bent over and ready to spring up when they're released from the tree? Can you roll the tree to get it in a better position so that it's easier to work with? Is it still kind of moving around? Is it not completely settled? And as you're working on it, always stay on the uphill side of the tree. That's the best way to keep, in case the tree might roll, that you're not going to get caught underneath it. Next is to make sure your footing is always clear. And it's easy to be in a hurry and want to get the limbing done and get onto the next tree, but always make sure you have good solid footing before you start to cut off some of the branches. And even if you're making just a few steps or a small movement, it's a good idea between when you're running and actually cutting to apply the chain brake, especially when you're working in and around where there's unsure footing. Is always to make sure your chain brake is on, so that if you fall, you're not going to fall on a running chainsaw. And cut the supporting limbs last, the ones that are holding the tree up off the ground. Let's save those for last. And always start from the bottom end of the tree, or what's called the butt end of the tree, and work your way to the top. Now that last one is something that I don't necessarily agree with. For certain circumstances, I might start at the top, work my way down, and in fact, on the next slide I'll talk a little bit more about that. But for limbs, you want to do the same thing. You've got compression wood and tension wood. And so your first cut is always on the compression wood side. So here this is a hanging limb. You might think, I'll just cut it straight down to the top. Well, it might not cut that easy. You might still get some tearing of the bark or of the wood, and it might not come off as cleanly as you think. So always make a cut on the compression, a small cut on the compression side, and then an offset cut. Both of these are always going to be offset cuts where it comes to limbs. And that way it'll come off cleaner if you offset cut them. And if you do need to turn the log to free a limb or to get so it's sitting better on the ground, you can buy what's called a cant hook. Here's a picture of it on the right side of your tree, of the screen, or also called a PV. They're sold where chainsaws are commonly sold, Ace Hardware or Farm and Fleet or Mills Fleet Farm. You can probably find those there. Okay, so here's an example of, let's say you just downed this tree and you're ready to start processing it. You can see that it's suspended off the ground by a pretty hefty limb, and it's going to be hard to work around that. So I know I said when you're limbing to always start on the bottom, but for a tree like this, where you have a pretty clear stem and almost the branches on the top, I start from the top and try to get some weight off of this tree so that it's easier to manipulate. So I'll cut off a lot of these branches and work my way down until I just have the main stem. And then I can try and roll it so it's off of this branch and so it's sitting flat on the ground. When sitting flat on the ground, that's the best time to do some processing of that stem, whether it's to cut it into 8-foot or 10-foot logs or into chainsaw-sized pieces. Now, I have, you can see on the screen, I have take a knee. And I think when you're processing a down tree that's laying flat on the ground, it's a good idea to kneel, one knee on the ground and one foot on the ground. And that way, you'll find if you try this, and I encourage you to give it a try, rather than just bending over at the waist to buck up a tree, take a knee and do it from that position. It's a lot easier on your body. It's a lot less fatiguing, and you're more apt to use the bar of the chainsaw to cut with rather than the tip of the chainsaw. And that's the best way you'll reduce the wear and tear on your chainsaw, by using the bar rather than the tip. So give it a try. I encourage you. And if you've got knee problems, it might be a little bit harder, but if you can, I encourage you to try taking a knee and bucking the tree up like that. Okay, the last thing I wanted to mention is that you will need to file, if you're harvesting trees to sell, you most likely will need to file what's called a cutting notice in the county that your land is located in. And so now there's certain circumstances where you don't need to file a cutting notice. If you're harvesting trees for firewood, you don't need to file this form. And this is just a simple form. This is one page that you file with the county clerk, your name, your address, where the property is located, just some real simple information. It's not that hard to file. But if you're just collecting firewood, you don't need to file this. Or clearing your land for agriculture, you don't need to file this. But if you don't file it, and you're harvesting trees to sell, you're going to, there's a hefty fine for it, well, $181. And if you've got delinquent taxes, the forfeiture can be even higher. So take the time to do it. If you're working with a forester or a logger on a harvest on your property, you can ask them to file the cutting notice, but it's your responsibility to file the cutting notice. Okay, I know I'm bumping up against 8 o'clock, so I'll stop there, and we'll answer a couple of questions that people might have.
Hey, Bill. So we have a few questions here, and I'm not sure we'll get to all of them because it's 7:58. But if anybody does have questions, feel free to type them in. If we don't get back to your question, we will respond to you via email later after the presentation. Could you go back to the slide where you have the table for density?
Here it is.
There you go. Could you clarify a little bit how density, the ideal density, is calculated or known?
Well, there's a lot of research that was done to identify what's the best density of trees to have, and this number by itself is useful. But when a forester is doing a calculation as to what's the best density to have, they use some other numbers too. They have a stocking chart that they utilize. I want to just give you this number so that if you're interested in doing this by yourself, you got some kind of guideline to utilize. So this number of 320 trees per acre, there's some research behind it, and it's going to be different for each species and what kind of forest you have. But it's a good ballpark as to think about what's the right number of trees to have. So I'd say utilize it, but there are some limitations to it. But it's still a good tool to use for things you might be doing on your forest.
Thank you. Yeah, so again, great number for folks if they're just looking for a number to shoot for. If you're one of those more mathematically minded and want to know a bit more, check out our woodlandinfo.org website, where the Owning Wisconsin Woodlands publications are, and we have a more detailed publication there on stocking charts if you just look under forestry concepts. We have, let's see, there's a question about how big a stump you should leave and doesn't matter, and I believe they mean by height of the stump.
Okay. The guidelines are about no more than a foot off the ground. The lower you can get it, the better, if you're cutting it yourself. But what I do is, cutting right at the forest floor is kind of difficult, and so the first cut I make might be a bit higher when I fell the tree, and then I come back and cut the rest of the stump down to the height that I like. And that's a little bit easier than trying to do the whole tree at once. So I'll cut the first one maybe at a more comfortable height for me, the felling wedge, and and the felling, the notch and the felling cut, and then come through afterwards and cut the stump down to a height that's better for me. But less than a foot is what you're looking for.
Okay, and a question about when you thin trees, will the stump start getting new trees, sprouting new trees, and what should you do to prevent the stump from starting to reproduce trees again?
That's a good question, and some trees will do that pretty vigorously. They'll produce what are called stump sprouts. Little sprouts will come up right from the stump. Oak is a great one that'll do that. Basswood's a great one to do that. White birch is a great species to do that. And so sometimes to reduce that, you might have to kill what's remaining of the tree. Otherwise, you can continue to cut the sprouts. And if it's something like oak, the deer will take care of those sprouts, but if it's something like red maple where you don't want more sprouts, or basswood where you don't want more sprouts, that might not be as tasty to the deer. You might have to treat them to get rid of them, or with an herbicide, treat the stump with an herbicide to kill the tree. So that's kind of an extreme thing to do. Otherwise, you can come through and clip them off with hand pruners or cut them with your chainsaw, but they might keep sprouting, and that's just the nature of the tree, and you can't really do a whole lot beyond killing the stump after you do the harvest.
Okay. There are a few more questions, and unfortunately it is 8:02 and I want to respect everybody's time. So like I mentioned, we will respond to any unanswered questions via email. I did just send a quick message to all. There was a question about DBH and what DBH means again, so you can see that response in your chat window. Next week's session is non-timber forest products, so we'll be talking about harvesting boughs, maple syrup, mushrooms, and a little bit more about firewood as well and firewood characteristics. So hopefully we'll see you again next week. And again, if you have any questions after the session, feel free to email us. And if anybody is working on a Mac or an iPad, feel free to email us as well, so we can figure out ways for you to ask us questions and so on during the presentation. With that, have a good evening and thank you for attending.